Welcome to Philosophy in a Nutshell, where we eliminate every doubt we may have about classical philosophy. I'm John Christensen, and today, it's the Renaissance. Well, by Renaissance, I really mean the humanistic philosophy, the philosophy that turns from theology to science, and how man becomes the measure of all things. Now, to many, this represents what we could call the end of classical philosophy, where classical philosophy as a continuous chain of ideas ceases to grow vertically and fragments horizontally into all sorts of different branches of the tree. This is similar to what we saw after Plato and Aristotle, where their very firm roots of formal philosophy ended up diverging into a whole variety of different attitudes. However, whereas the many Hellenic philosophies eventually reconverged in the Roman period, the fragments of Western philosophy in the humanistic period will remain fragmented and fragment further as we enter the modern period and the present day. There are those who will try to link all of these philosophies together, but those would be specialists. This is philosophy in a nutshell. We're talking about generalities here. And so we really just have a laundry list left over of some of the more famous philosophers of the last 500 years. We will begin with the one who threw the extraordinary rigor and order of the scholastic period into doubt, the Prince of Doubt himself, René Descartes. Descartes is a Frenchman of the skeptical persuasion. We haven't heard that word skeptical for a long time. It flourished in the Academy of Athens. Cicero made great work of it, but otherwise we haven't heard much of it in the last 1,000 years. That is, until Descartes brings it back with a hyperbolic, extreme version of that skeptical doubt, which we call Cartesian doubt. Cartesian doubt is the absolute negation of all ideas, all knowledge that we cannot, with complete surety, know to be true. By eliminating any first principles that we realize are not so first as they seem, by finding even the smallest little crack in their soundness, we can pare our beliefs back to the very kernel, the very simplest truth, and use that as the foundation of complete 100% knowledge without any room for lingering doubt. To show you just how extreme and complete this Cartesian doubt can be, Descartes' meditations begin with the three doubts. The first of the three doubts is our doubt of the senses. Descartes explains that our sight, our smell, all of our senses, the things on which we rely to know anything beyond our own skulls, are fallible and very easily deceived. Not only does he describe various maladies of the eye and the ear that show how our seeing and hearing can be in some way imperfect or incomplete, he also says that the complete deprivation of a sense does not mean it disappears, but that it presents us with completely false information, providing us with what might be the first historical description of phantom limb syndrome. If a soldier who has lost his arm can still feel that arm, then not only can the senses be imperfect, but they can be completely opposite to the truth. The second of these doubts is the doubt of our mind. Descartes points out that our mind is capable of conjuring extraordinarily detailed realities that are in fact irrealities. Our dreams can be so compelling, so seemingly true, that our intellect is completely incapable of distinguishing it from reality. He even refers obliquely to lucid dreaming, those rare and essentially random occasions where one is capable of recognizing and controlling one's dreams. But even then, he recognizes that we are dealing with phantoms, dealing with irrealities. Finally, and perhaps most precociously, Descartes gives us the third and final doubt, the doubt of reality itself. Descartes wonders aloud if everything we see and hear is in fact an illusion, a projection created by some exterior spirit or demon, something he calls the evil genius. Even if our senses are working perfectly, even if our mind is in perfect order, perhaps there is something outside of us that is capable of tricking our faculties for understanding the world beyond. So, seemingly every step of the way from reality to perception, there is something, some reason for suspecting that what we see is not what's really going on. Even if that likelihood is very small, even if we have every reason to believe that what we perceive is what we get. Even the smallest possibility of doubt is enough for Descartes to say that it is not perfect knowledge and it must be discarded. This is a very low point for us, where everything we seem to see and know and think is unreliable. And it is tempting to suggest that this is the conclusion of subjectivity, that nothing is real and that nothing is objective. However, this is not Descartes' point. Descartes' point is to now, in the midst of this intellectual darkness, to grasp around the dark and try to find those single filaments of truth that remain to us. So, what is that single truth, that single thing that we can know with absolute confidence? This is where Descartes steps in with his famous axiom, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What does this mean? Let's go back to Avicenna, who said that even a man falling in the midst of an infinite abyss, someone whose entire sense perception has been taken away from them, is capable of thinking and capable of recognizing his own thinking. And as long as one perceives one's intellectual work, one can perceive a self. If a self exists, then a reality exists. If a reality exists, then something needs to account for it. And it is from that single, very narrow ground that one is capable of building more and more and more, and eventually arriving back at a satisfying and reasonable worldview. Descartes spends the rest of his meditations working from that square one, from that existence of the self, to try and prove the existence of God. The argument he makes follows along similar lines to what we've seen before. It's not especially different from what Aquinas or Anselm or even Avicenna gives us before him. That is not his innovation. His innovation is that doubt, his use of doubt not as a tool of subjectivity, but a tool of paring away subjectivity and identifying the absolute objective core of our beliefs. At about the same time that Descartes was working in France, in England we had a gentleman named Thomas Hobbes, who was first and foremost a political philosopher. Hobbes was writing at a time where ideas like sovereignty and nationhood were developing in fresh but often brutal ways. And so Hobbes wrote The Leviathan, an aptly named work of massive grappling with those ideas to try and provide a sense of what makes sovereignty, what makes a nation good and just. Hobbes gives us the idea of a social contract, the idea that a nation or civilization is a contract between people to avoid what would otherwise be the chaotic state of nature. Unlike Cicero, who suggests that nature itself informs a certain right and wrong that is evident to the people who live there, Hobbes says that nature gives us only one law, which is that everyone has a right to everything. And unless we agree to make some sacrifices, everyone is locked in a zero-sum game of constant competition. So the social contract is a mutual surrender of lesser rights in order to secure for the various members of that society the greater good of peace and prosperity. Even so, not all social contracts are equal, and not all people are members of the same contract. And so you end up having multiple nations, multiple sovereignties, all competing the way that individuals had competed before. This leads us to the Hobbesian trap, the constant state of fear that a sovereign nation must exist in so long as it has neighbors. That fear will persist until they gain an advantage over their neighbor, which causes their neighbor to fear in like measure. This will go back and forth in a constant arms race against the other, until theoretically one must perish. Now, the obvious solution to this Hobbesian trap is that everyone agrees no longer to compete, no longer to aggress against each other. But this solution depends on each individual sovereignty being equally confident in every other sovereignty's good faith, which is a pretty poor bet. If Hobbes is a little too dark for your English political philosophers, then we can turn to John Locke, who was writing only about 50 years later, but had an entirely different take. Locke follows in the line of Cicero, saying that there are some very distinct natural rights which are inherently good, not the mere chaos that Hobbes gives us. He says we have a right to life, a right to property, and a right to freedom. On the point of property, he says that natural things in and of themselves are nobody's property as such. What makes property property, what makes property your own, is your infusion of labor into that property. This labor theory of production says that if I stumble onto a parcel of land, that land isn't mine or anybody else's. But if I should live in that land and cultivate it, till the soil, build buildings, then what was originally nobody's suddenly is infused with something of myself. I've put a part of my essence into it. And so now my property has become not merely myself, but the land which I have put myself into. Going back to the social contract, that means that the mutual sacrifice that members of a state make involves a sacrifice of some of that personal property. But in just the same way that labor upon a piece of land that is not ours makes it our property, sacrificing some of our property to a state makes that state in some way infused with our property. The state, therefore, is the joint property of all of its sacrificing members. A state only exists as long as its members actively and consensually participate in it. A state, therefore, is a matter of consent of the governed. And if the sovereign, the leader, the king, should ever lose that consent, then the state has already ceased to exist, and his right to rule has been revoked. The way in which this will feed into attitudes about the Republic and America and revolution, I think, speak for themselves. Locke resurrects some of those early pre-Socratic ideas of the difference between the traits that a thing has and the traits that we observe in a thing. He distinguishes between these two as primary and secondary qualities. A primary quality is that feature that does not depend on external observation. So if we call an object red, primary redness is whatever combination of chemicals in the paint or angle of the light that makes it appear a certain way if someone is going to observe it. But a secondary property is the actual effect that those primary qualities have when observed. So you could say secondary redness is the actual psychological effect that I experience when that combination of light and paint finally hits my eye. The second proceeds from the first, but they are not the same qualities, and distinguishing between the two is critical for understanding the difference between what a thing is and how a thing is observed. Speaking of observation, Locke proposes that the human intellect begins as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, that we don't begin with some preset of knowledge or intelligence, that everything in our heads, everything in our minds is learned starting from a perfectly blank, perfectly chaotic beginning. Locke says that we don't have any information, we don't have any intellectual features at the moment of conception, and therefore the idea that original sin, some pre-existent condition that makes us evil as opposed to good, doesn't make sense from an intellectual standpoint. But he does believe in original sin. So where does original sin fall in the midst of a tabula rasa viewpoint? His solution is that evil is not a quality. It is not an attribute. It is a deprivation of quality. That evil is merely the absence of grace, and that grace, godliness, is a feature that man does not have, as opposed to evil being a feature that man does have. Thus, the tabula rasa human is a fallen human. That whatever Adam was at the beginning, he was not a tabula rasa, but he lost it for the rest of mankind. Speaking again of observation, specifically how perhaps observation is not just all we have, but all there is. Let's talk about Berkeley. In a world where most philosophers are in some way materialists, meaning that they are concerned with the reality of the material world, George Berkeley, the Anglo-Irish philosopher, has the almost completely unique distinction of being an immaterialist. What does that mean? It means that George Berkeley denied the reality of the physical world. In Berkeley's own words, esse est percepi, to be is to be perceived. As far as Berkeley is concerned, if a tree should fall in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, then not only did the tree not fall, but the tree didn't exist, and in fact the woods don't exist. Berkeley denies the reality of material substance. He doesn't think that if I perceive a waterfall, that there is anything material, anything real, besides the mere perception of a waterfall. That perception itself, the experience that's happening in my head, is all there is. This runs us into numerous problems, such as why should it be a waterfall as opposed to anything else? Why do I get the specific sense experiences that I do if there's nothing with distinct features or traits or properties causing that image of a waterfall to appear? Berkeley's solution to this is a surprisingly unphilosophical one. He resorts to pure theology and says, it's God. God is interacting directly with your sensory abilities and providing you with images, with sounds, with all of the sensory experiences that you get. There is no intermediary between God and you. God is directly causing you to experience certain things as if they were physically real, even though they are not physically real. In short, Berkeley essentially says that that evil genius, that spirit that Descartes brought up that was simply feeding you a sort of matrix world of false images, is God himself, and that he's doing it for good reasons as opposed to evil ones. This is a surprising and perhaps tedious position to take, and it's difficult to understand why one would take the position except for the joy of simplicity. Perhaps all Berkeley wants is the pure simplicity of a universe where all there is God and man, with no intermediation. This extreme form of absolute denial of anything unaccountable is not over yet, and by the time we reach its most zealous, its most determined champion, we will do away even with the divine agent and bring it back entirely to humanity. I refer to Immanuel Kant, and we have entered the existential arena. What may I know? What should I do? What can I hope? These are the kind of questions with which Kant is concerned. He is not focused on knowledge itself, but the possibility of and the capability of knowledge. To Kant, things in and of themselves, things as they are, independent of observation, are by definition unobserved and unobservable. Therefore, it is not possible to know things as they are. Those necessarily exist in a sort of shadow realm, permanently separated from us by the veil of observation. All we have to go on is the way things appear. And Kant refuses to let us treat the things as they appear as having any reliable relationship with the things as they are. Because again, even the most coherent, even the most consistent patterns in things as they appear remain apparent only. Our only concern, therefore, is to study our own ability to study, to know our own ability to know. The things that we know, the things that we study are, well, immaterial. They do not matter. What matters is our own confidence in our own faculties. We call this transcendental idealism because it transcends above the mere things that we are looking at, mere because they're unapproachable, but also because they are lesser than the facultative reason we use to observe them. I know I'm using a lot of rather abstract terms here, a lot of terms that don't seem really well linked with anything real. If you're feeling a bit lost, so are the rest of us. Kant clearly isn't dealing very much with real things at all. Real things are not especially interesting to him, which might seem like a very poor foundation for understanding reality, and yet that is the track he's taking us on. So let's turn to some of the smaller features of Kantian philosophy, the kind of things that will continue to be useful to us even once we've left this especially shadowy wood. One very useful term that Kant gives us is different kinds of knowledge, a priori and a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge is that which we know prior to any kind of observation, things that we know simply because they are self-evident. A proposition like all men are male is a priori because it doesn't require any kind of experimentation. It's already built into the very definition of the words. Whereas a posteriori knowledge depends on some kind of observation. It is not self-evident simply because it has been uttered. Some kind of observation or argument is necessary before the truth of that a posteriori truth is clear. We are tempted to go back to what we said about transcendental idealism and say, oh, well, would a priori truths then be objectively real things, things as they are? No, they're still observations. But again, we're not so concerned with this sort of shadow realm that Kant is giving us because for our purposes, it's going to be the terminology that is most useful, not the actual conclusions. Another pair of terms that Kant gives us is noumenon and phenomenon. The noumenon is that thing in and of itself, a thing independent of observation, which again, Kant says is entirely remote from us, which we can never perceive or observe. The phenomenon, then, is a thing observed, a thing as it appears, which is the entire set of our playground, the entire range of things that we're capable of working with or dealing with. Despite this complete distancing of the self from any kind of objective reality, Kant does try to provide a certain framework for moral philosophy as well. His main moral precept is the categorical imperative, which is a sort of marching order or rule of thumb to ask yourself anytime you're faced with a moral proposition. The categorical imperative asks whether what you're about to do is what you would wish is the universal law for all such situations. In other words, if what you're about to do is the same thing you would demand of others if they were in the same state, then it is a good law and you should do it. If the thing you're about to do is advantageous for you, but would be disadvantageous if someone else did it, or if you did it at a different time, then it is not a universal law and should not be conducted. Moreover, a perfect law is one that is not only good every time it is done, but it is one that is wrong to not do in any situation. In short, it's an imperfect law if it is always right to do it, but it is a perfect law if it is always right to do it and always wrong not to do it. There is a difference between those two. Kant even turns this darkened lens towards the subject of aesthetics. In fact, he's one of the earliest aesthetic philosophers we have. He tries to define beauty, true beauty, as a feature that is independent of the observer. A thing is beautiful, truly beautiful, if its ineffable quality that makes it pleasurable to behold cannot be defined as any of that particular object's parts, and more critically, any of your parts. Do you like that painting because of some distinct and describable feature of the painting? Then it is not a truly beautiful painting. And for that matter, do you like that painting because of some memory you have or some association you have with it? Then once again, it is not truly beautiful. Beauty in the most pure sense, according to Kant, is beyond description. Again, it's a thing in and of itself. And we merely, again, observe its imperfect phenomena. The thing that it seems is beautiful. And our sense of beauty is a mere shadow presented to us by the thing as it appears. Saying that beauty is necessarily unattainable and that what we perceive to be beauty is in fact the mere shadowy appearance of something that is in fact transcendentally beautiful but permanently beyond our reach is fundamentally frustrating. And yet it is only the first step in what we will describe as the truly modern period of philosophy, after which any true link, any true through line, all the way back to Plato and otherwise, is lost. I could talk about Schopenhauer, who takes the Kantian line even further. We could talk about Kierkegaard, who talks about the relationship between our subjective pains and our transcendental objective good. We could talk about Wittgenstein and the philosophy of language. But at this point, that particularization, that fragmentization, has become so innumerable and so far removed from what we started out with that it becomes an entirely different discipline. And so, let's end the journey here. We have gone a long way from the prehistoric world of Greece to those early stirrings of original philosophy, of trying to find that arche of all things, to a strange and chaotic end of people wrestling with the difference between what things are and how things seem. I hope you find the steps we've taken along the way edifying and interesting. And if not, then I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Classics Unraveled, which is not philosophy in a nutshell. It's Classics Unraveled. Join me as we discuss Jane Austen and zombies. At last, my friends, we arrive at the final like jar. We arrive at the final subscribe button, and I say for the last time on this journey that I am John Christensen. Fare thee well.